and welcome back to another episode of the Cardboard Herald, my chance to talk with creative gamers and game creators. And joining me today from Leader Games is Joshua Yearsley. Welcome to the show, man.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be here.
Yeah, well, you're like, I'm collecting the leader folks, I guess. One by one, I'm having you all on here. But it's an expansive group. You're part of a big, giant team. You're an editor and developer on staff, but the hats seem to be in multitude. How'd you get your start with Leader Games?
Yeah, so I started with Leader Games all the way back on Vast. The basic story is that I was at a playtesting convention, this convention, great convention called Metatopia. And I playtested a game by Jeff Tidball about little cardboard cars rolling around in kind of a death rally thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a freelancer in those days, and so we talked a little bit, exchanged business cards. And he later emailed me and he said, so I read an article on your website about this rule book. It was an article about Chaos in the Old World, a game that everybody should play. I love it. It's
Eric Lang's best.
Eric Lang's best, yeah. And I had done a sort of loving critique of the rule book, and he had said, well, I wrote that rule book and I agree with everything you said in the critique. So thank you for that. And I have a friend, Patrick Leader, who's looking for a rulebook editor. And this was for Vast. And so I came onto the project kind of at the very, very end stages, kind of, weeks left before the thing went to print. And so it was one of those kind of classic for a freelance editor cannonball run scenarios where it was like, okay, fix the thing.
I love it.
And so I did that and it went well. And so basically over the years, was there for Vast, and then when Root came around, they brought me on much earlier in the project, and so I was working with Cole, basically throughout development, just being an eye for usability. I was doing a lot of play testing, doing a lot of rules writing and editing, suggesting rules changes to make the rules easier to write, basically, because the line between rules writing and development is very thin. And so I worked as the rules person and as a developer on Root, and then it's just basically evolved since then. I have come more into, basically, as you alluded to, wearing more and more and more hats over time. So starting out as rules editor, going to rules writer, developer, doing a little trying my hand at some basic graphic design, mostly like page layout and blocking,
Right.
and then design work. So definitely, when they brought me on in 2020 as a full-timer, that was during Oath. That was the point basically where I really started to transition into doing a lot more design work. And so my first real design credit was on the Marauder expansion for Root. I designed the Keepers in Iron, and then definitely on Ark's designs a lot of the campaign stuff.
And we're all grateful to you for that. I mean, I
Thank
don't
you.
know if you know this, but Arc seems to be received pretty well.
Yeah, we're very happy with it. Yeah, it was definitely a project that made me feel like I was losing my mind a little bit at some points in time, just because it was such a huge project. It was our largest project by far. That's saying a lot because we tend to do fairly large project, like a
Right.
lot of fairly large projects in the studio. And Arcs in total was like the size of like Root and Oath combined, basically. So yeah, but we're very happy.
Well, you are here because you are on the precipice of the Kickstarter for the Route 4 expansion. And I want to get into that because you are the designer of that. However, with this history of being a rulebook editor, and just an editor in general who, developed this passion upon the pretty poor rulebook for Chaos in the Old World, What sort of advice do you have for prospective publishers and game designers on like what makes a good rule book? Because even Leader Games, who you've been with for quite some time, has had some iteration and lessons, such to the point where I look at the Arcs rulebook as like, man, this feels organic and intuitive, and like it balances this nice duality of being both formal and also kind of like a friend being like, oh yeah, it just, do this.
Yeah, so really the number one piece of advice that I can give to anybody writing a rule book or any publisher is that you have to play test your rule book. Like, there's tons of things that editors can learn. There are tons of rules of thumb for writing rules and best practices that sometimes have to be broken. But my number one thing always is every game is unique, and your rules of thumb are only going to get you so far. A game is an ecosystem of and is an ecosystem of mechanics, and the way that those mechanics interact is going to create unique interactions and unique potential points of confusion in your game. And I cannot tell you the number of times where, like, I've worked as a rules writer and editor for over a decade now, and I can't tell you the number of times where I've written something and gone, ah, yes, this is understandable, and then I put it in front of a reader and they go, I have no idea what this means. um and I think that's just a reflection of the fact that language, the great strength of language is that it's so flexible. You can use it in so many ways, but that's also a potential weakness, in that when you're trying to write something formal that is meant to be followed in a specific way, that can be very difficult, especially when you have lots of interacting systems, when you have people naturally bringing their preconceptions about how something is supposed to work to a game. I sometimes liken game rules, as code that has infinite number of compilers. So when you're writing code for computers, there you have a compiler and it's compiling in a specific way. But every person has a different brain, they have different conceptions, and so you have this code, but you have millions of hundreds of thousands of people playing your game, millions of people playing your game, and they're all coming at it from a different way. And so because that's true, you really, really need to play test your rule book.
And maybe you have the insight that you could appreciate this as much as me, but one crusade as a reviewer, as a tabletop gamer that I've kind of gone on over the past maybe like 5 years or so is the realization that the big square floppy rulebooks suck. And just like really in general, that's more a symptom of what I think is an afterthought in creating a rule book, that a rule book is the first component that anyone is likely to interact with in your game, and it needs to be treated with as much importance as any other component to the game itself. And that includes the tactile nature of it, the function, the ability to navigate it, and also pick it up and put it down and easily reference it.
Right. This was kind of a funny but important controversy in board games is rulebook size. But yeah, no, I agree that I personally do not like large, sort of like the standard Euro game box size square, a rule book, because like objects are meant to be sized to humans. And when a rulebook is that big, not only is it, when it's open, not only is it like at that point basically like as large as like a human who like has their arms extended out,
Right.
but like if you're trying to hold it in one hand, it's just gonna flop. And so sort of just like looking at the laws of physics and looking at like human shapes, it just seems very like a very bad form factor to me. There are some advantages to it. Having more space in your spread can mean that on things like setup graphics, you can really have like lots of good zoom ins, and like there are advantages. Like I'm not going to say there are no advantages, There are certainly advantages, but yeah, it's often really bad from like a form factor perspective, and it also means that sometimes you can be tempted, depending upon what you're trying to convey on the page, to try to put too much stuff on one page.
Okay, now that we've lost everyone but the dorkiest of dorks here for the real rulebook talk, let's talk about what everyone wants to know about, which is the fourth Root expansion, Root 4, A New Hope, or whatever we want to call it here, because the
Yeah.
title is still, is it unannounced or just undetermined?
It is actually undetermined, and the reason part of the reason for this is that we are still working on it. We are going to be launching in October, and in classic leader games style, it's going to be an open development process. Um, as we run the campaign and in the months afterward, we are like I'm still going to be finishing the game, and people will get to see how that goes. And at this point, we do have a fairly solid sense of the conceits of the factions, but especially like we do want to kind of finish determining what exactly is going to be in the box before we name it, right? Like we want to make sure that the name is representative of everything that's in the box. And right now we have announced the two factions that are in the box, but we haven't finalized exactly what the other stuff is going to be, and that's going to be important to naming it. So
You've said the word box so much that I can't not ask this, and I know I've annoyed Cole and Patrick. I'm not sure if I've annoyed Nick yet in asking this, but I am going to ask you because everyone wants to know, is there going to be a big box at some point? And I know Patrick has said that he's reticent towards the idea of a big box, mainly because it's are you going to be able to make a return on that? It's a costly project, but people keep on asking. Even as I was announcing that we were going to do this interview, people are like, what's up with the big box? Can we get a big box? Is this going to have a big box to hold all my root stuff? So what's the news on the big box?
yeah, well, the big box, like the first thing about the big box is that when you make a big box, and I feel like I can say box so many times it's gonna lose meaning. When
Uh-huh.
you make a big
I love it.
box, you want to you want to make sure that it actually holds everything, and is not sort of like immediately obsolete. And so, like when we made arcs, for example, we wanted to make sure that it was forward compatible with additional expansion content, et cetera, et cetera. Um, like the thing about Root, though, is that some of the components are quite big. So, like the faction boards, for example, and the a huge aspect of designing a box and thus box inserts. When you're looking at player board size components, a difference of like the difference between, oh, we're planning for like two more or four more or whatever, for components that when you stack them up are taking up that much area, and because they're nice and thick, the difference between two and four is actually like quite substantial when you're thinking about like overall box dimensions. You just really want to make sure that you know exactly like what needs to fit in that box, right? And so yeah, like for a game like Root, where a fundamental component is the player board, I think it's a lot harder unless you are absolutely sure you know what needs to go in there, to make it and not have it be sort of like an immediate disappointment.
Unless you re-release all the faction boards except on nice glossy cardstock that is, a fraction of the thickness.
That is exactly true, and that's actually something that we've been bopping around in the studio is some other publishers have you know have put out nice cardstock, even foil cardstock in some cases versions. So there's like some, I personally, like as a player, like I personally don't understand it, but some people do like that. So that is definitely something that we kind of bopped around at the studio are releasing for those who like it. The alt player boards that are thinner, but still nice and glossy and pretty.
Well, what's the pitch like when you're trying to come up with new content? Like, I understand that you were involved in designing one of the factions in the last expansion, but is it just like a grand council is called, like it's the Council of Elrond, and just anyone can step forward and be like, I shall take the root factions to Mordor? You know, like who comes up with the ideas for who's even going to be in charge of the next expansion, because you're helming this thing.
Yeah, so it's a combination of a few different things. So if we're talking about I'll talk about project leads first. So the one of the very important elements is simply who's tired and who's not tired, because it's tiring being a project lead. You are the person responsible for the project getting done. You are managing it like it's ultimately your responsibility, and it's a lot of pressure. And so that's sort of like thing number one is who at the studio actually feels like it right now. We try not to like stack projects in a way where somebody is like immediately going from being a project lead into being a project lead on another project right after that. We at least want to give them some time to recover, and or if they are going to be a project lead again, have it be like a smaller project. So like for the Oath expansion, for example, Cole is sort of like immediately jumping from Ark's work onto Oath expansion, but like Oath expansion in the grand scheme of things is like way smaller of a project than Ark's was. Like Ark's was our largest project by far. And like Oath expansion is just it's not in the same tier. So that's part of it, is like trying to keep a rhythm where people are not burning out. Other aspects include things like testing new talent. So like for me, for example, like I've been involved in design and development for years and years and years at the studio. But I've never been like a solo project lead. So in this case, basically the studio is like making a bet that like I can handle all of the other elements of being a project lead. Because like as a studio at this point, we are trying to transition into like having two projects that are like pretty much in production at the same time. We've very much been a like one project at a time studio throughout the years, and we were trying to make this leap. And so, in that case, you need more people who are comfortable being project leads if you have two projects at once. So that's another part of it is basically trying things out, trying out new people, seeing whether it works out. And if it doesn't, that's fine. You can figure things out. Like in fact, even on Marauder, like that project is very interesting because if you like look at the box cover, you'll see that there are actually 4 names on that box cover. And so like that's a project, for example, where the project lead basically sort of changed over time. And it changed depending on like the part of the projects that you were looking at. It was almost split into two groups where there was basically a very hirelings focused group and a very factions focused group. And so project lead, it's in some cases can be a flexible term depending upon the needs of the project and depending upon where people are at. And what is going on in the studio and in people's lives. But yeah, those are some of the aspects that go into thinking about project leads. And now for the expansion and for factions, that is really something where when somebody comes on to be for root expansions, the person that is coming on as that project lead is the person broadly who came up with those faction ideas and presented them. And so like for this faction, for this expansion, you know, basically like I was like Cole and Patrick and other people at the studio talked with me earlier in the year, you know, around the time that Arcs was like locked in and done through like the early parts of this year in January and February, and we're like, hey, you know, we definitely want to like think about a root expansion. Do you want to start thinking about faction ideas? Because the idea is basically like, if you have some ideas and if you're passionate about them and if you show them to us and we're like, this sounds like a good idea, like we can make this happen with you as a project lead. And so I basically, you know, around, you know, January, February, started basically thinking through like the very, very early concepting. And then by around, I'd say like April, um, I showed off some early proofs of concept to everybody, and people were like, "Yeah, this is great. Let's make this thing happen." Basically,
Of the Batwing Assembly and the lily pad diaspora.
exactly. Yeah. So really, it's a process, at least for like root expansions, of like, you know, you talk to somebody, you say, "Hey, are you interested in this?" And then there is essentially a proof of concept stage at the studio where the project hasn't been formalized yet. Like it hasn't been like that. There hasn't been a like, okay, we are definitely going to do this. Like let's start full steam ahead and start planning everything out. So there is definitely, and this goes for new games as well. You know, a proof of concept stage where you're feeling out kind of what this thing looks like. And only once that proof of concept is done do we sort of like convene people, talk about this, start getting like a very rough business plan together. And so it sort of proceeds by stages until we hit a final, like, okay, the studio at large, like both the creative team and the operations team have agreed that like this project makes creative sense, makes business sense. We have the people for it, we have the money for it, like everything is clicking in. So it is an iterative process.
And with these two factions, like where did you start? Was it more of a thematic thing where you thought about, okay, these are the types of animals I'd like to represent, and what are some concepts that thematically we could have for these animals, and then broaden out into how that's represented mechanically? Or did you have like intentions on ways of bringing new mechanics into Root, and you wanted to somehow reflect that on a thematic perspective?
Yeah, so for me on this expansion, basically the first thing that I did in concepting was I thought about the parts of Root that I liked the most, that I wanted to see more of. Like that's kind of, you know, the very basics of the process,
Which are
which are I basically went back to Riverfolk and thought about player politics.
mm,
Um, I thought about player politics, and I thought about the idea of the woodland as a character. So especially as it relates to the lizards. One thing that I really, really love about the lizards is the drawing out of a um, part of woodland politics at large. So Root, for me, like the thing that I love most is how you can tell real political stories in a little bottle in this game, can tell real political stories um, in the game. So I wanted to make sure that whatever I came up with was really engaging with the larger politics of the woodland. And so when I really thought about woodland politics, what came up were um, diasporas. So the idea of basically integrating new people and a new suit into the woodland and how that would affect woodland politics. Um, and then a sense of, well, the people of the woodlands, quite a few of them, probably all of them, they're not really all about this war. Like typically inhabitants of a place that's in the midst of a civil war, it's kind of a bad situation. They don't really like it. Um, and so thinking about the idea of, well, we have factions like the Woodland Alliance that are trying to um, build up a power base by kind of accelerating the war and kind of taking it to a point, like making the war so intolerable and pointing out the intolerableness of it that they gain support that they can then use to end it, sort of a violent accelerationism. I thought about, well, what's kind of the other side of that? Where are the parts of the woodland that are trying to mediate, that are trying to cool down the war, basically? And so thinking of the woodland as a character and a faction that could sort of represent that kind of sentiment in the woodland. So yeah, really thinking about player politics and the woodland as a character were my foundations for thinking about these factions.
Leader has set up for themselves kind of this interesting expectation for Root, not only in the game itself, which is a fabulous game that I love quite a bit. I made that note, but there's also the periphery. You now have hirelings with the game. You now have Clockwork expansions with the game, and so any additive faction, are you thinking about the clockwork nature of it, or thinking about how it's going to have a hireling integrated into Root? Is that something that we can expect through this expansion, or will that be maybe after there's another two factions and we can get Clockwork 3 and Hirelings 2? Like there's more to consider in Root than maybe at the time that it first came out.
Yeah, so definitely as far as hirelings go, there will be a hirelings pack uh, during this campaign for these two new factions and a new neutral faction. So that is certain. As far as like solo and Clockwork stuff goes, it is something that we are talking about actively in the studio. It is not something that is going to be in this campaign, but it is a topic of active discussion, especially because fairly recently we hired on a solo games specialist as our one of our new developers, Liz Davidson.
Shout out to Beyond Solitaire.
Absolutely, yeah. Liz is great, and we wanted to bring her on partially because we really want to think out solo. Like we are so. One thing about the studio is that a lot of people in the studio are like we're we're not that good at making solo stuff. I don't, like the people who are actually in the studio, which is part of the reason why for Clockwork, we reached out to Benjamin, who is a really good solo developer, because we knew basically that like we have always struggled with this sort of stuff. And so now bringing in Liz, who is really, really good at solo work, into the studio fairly recently, we just need more time to figure out exactly how we want to look at solo stuff for moving forward. So that won't be in the campaign.
What is your favorite part of the expansion so far? Like the thing that you feel is most innovative to the world of Root or the mechanics of Root, or the thing that brings you the most joy when you think about playing it as just a fan?
Yeah, so the thing that I love the most is, so in both of these factions, I sort of the thing that I want to highlight in these factions are player relationships beyond combat. And so one interaction that I love is with the Diaspora faction, the dynamic nature of how this new suit changes the way players treat each other and think about each other. Because an important thing about the Diaspora is that the other players at the table can look at the Diaspora as a partner, can look at them as a threat, or both at the same time. To describe a little bit about them, they are adding this new suit to the map. They are also adding a new deck of cards that are frog suited. So this is a suit whose value is going to change dynamically over time, and there are incentives both for other players to cooperate with them, to even exploit them in some ways. Um, for example, by using the frogs' suit tokens on the map as their own crafting pieces, but then also to basically incite the frogs toward militancy, changing the suits of clearings from whatever they are into frog suited clearings. So this sort of dual nature of this faction as both an asset and a threat, and using that as a framework for thinking about how are people used in like proxy, how do factions use people as for proxy wars against other factions, and thinking about the other shades of conflict beyond just I want to battle you and I'm going to roll some dice now. So yeah, thinking about the other ways, and specifically how woodland sentiments can be used in conflict and cooperation.
The last expansion, Marauder, gave us two really strong militant factions that can be like the underpinnings of lower player count games, which rely on that sort of presence, that sort of reach. What about these new factions? Are they going to be suitable for lower player count games, or are they going to be dependent on this being a 4 or 5 player route?
Yeah, so I certainly think that the diaspora faction is suitable for lower player count games. It's probably going to have 20 warriors. The assembly, I would say it's probably somewhere in the middle. It's more of a pink kind of, if we have red factions and pink and white factions, it's kind of a pink faction. I think that like the assembly is going to really shine the most when you have like a 4 player game, just because it's a very it centers player politics quite a bit. So I think that the diaspora, I think you're going to find that it plays well at all player counts, and I think the assembly benefits from having at least 3 players. I think that's kind of going to be the the player count ideals for those factions.
I talked to Nick about this when we were talking about the Ahoy expansion. That leader has this tendency to have this crowdfunding and then long development time. We even mentioned it earlier on in this interview. That is in contrast to a lot of other studios where they want to get everything as polished as possible and then launch, and then it's just the manufacturing and delivery. How are you finding as a designer, as a developer, that you're adjusting to this much more public, iterative process where people get to be involved or have opinions about your work before it's even really done cooking? And you actually get to the stage where you're, saying it's done, we're manufacturing it.
Yeah, no, I actually, for the most part, I really enjoy it. I work by talking. Like, it's so much easier for me to think through problems when I'm talking with somebody than if I'm just like this. Of course, there are stages where I have to just go into a quiet room and think like that, but it's often so much easier for me to talk through my problems with others. And so, for example, our Discord, our Woodland Warriors Discord, throughout the course of Ark's development, like I was talking with people all the time on there. And it's really important because sometimes you can get really stuck as a designer and as a developer, and it can feel very lonely if you don't have anybody to talk to. And so just being able to like be honest about here's where I am, here's where I'm stuck. If anyone wants to chat about it, I'm happy to chat about it. I think that's very, very good for me. And in fact, like I've been pretty open. People who came up to me at Gen Con and some of the interviews I did at Gen Con, I've been pretty open about the fact that I'm very, very happy with where the diaspora is right now. The assembly is has been struggling. I've been struggling with the assembly a bit. Um, not in terms of sort of like the core concept, but in exactly how I want to instrumentalize it in a way that feels um, just very satisfying. And so, yeah, I enjoy being open about where I feel good about things, where I'm struggling with things, because otherwise it just doesn't feel, it feels lonely and it doesn't feel really authentic. So,
Do you get involved with Kyle's process in giving like a look and an identity to these factions? Because you came up with who they are in the realm of Root. And so I imagine that there's a certain aesthetic or appearance or, like identifiers that you want to go along with that. So are you giving just broad concepts to Kyle, or are you actually going like, oh, you should, have a scarf there, or, wouldn't it be cool if he had a stick and bindle?
so as far as art goes with Kyle, the faction concepts were pretty fully in place by the time I went to talk with Kyle. We basically we played through them through the factions, and there are a number of things that we talked about in terms of specific aesthetics. So, for example, especially with the frogs, there are so many different, like there are so many different kinds of frog aesthetics out there. And so certainly we talked about using Frog and Toad as kind of a touch point for broad aesthetics for that faction. We definitely want to give the sense of like the last thing that we want to do is give the sense in this faction of some kind of like ugly or gross frog.
Yeah, that makes sense because, like if you put too much of an identity on this, especially with using a term like diaspora, then it might feel a little too pointed, to like real world politics. Of course, there are plenty of diasporas out there, but, it would be very easy to evoke some nastier sides of politics and maybe opinions about refugees and unsettled people who have come into maybe an unwelcoming land.
Exactly. We don't want to, Root explores all of these complicated and interesting political questions. And we want to represent the world in a way where people can actually have a conversation about um, industrialism, capitalism, revolution, um, courts, warfare, all of these different things. And diasporas um, are a not very much represented like concept in many board games out there, especially outside of the like war game space. The kind of the GMT games style game space. And so we want to explore this concept without putting undue notions through our aesthetics that are going to like tilt people's perception of what exactly this diaspora is doing. Is it proper, improper, and like basically like the we basically want to give players the tools to understand a process that can often be very very messy, and where people have lots of opinions, lots of priorities, and different values. And so we want to present it in a way where people can explore this concept and play with it and try to understand it better without imposing too much onto the player through those aesthetics.
With the Batwing assembly, because you said that this is the one that is less there, you're still cooking this one a bit. Why don't you give just kind of like the nutshell what you want these to be and why it isn't there, and like what's your process over the period of time that you're going to be working on this to get it there, because people are going to be giving you money. They're giving you their faith via the Kickstarter backing that you are going to deliver something awesome. So what's the goal, and how are you going to get there with them?
Yep. Yeah. So the goal essentially is to, again, to present the woodland as a character, to present politics as a way of cooling down the war and ending the war by means other than armed conflicts. And so the basic question then is, well, then how is that represented within the game? The faction for a long time um, has its foundation in card play, because the cards in Root really are sort of the prime place where we represent the relationships between creatures in the woodland and the actual factions. The factions themselves are not the woodlands. It's really the cards, the suits and clearings, like these sort of more abstract concepts are representing the actual creatures in the forest. And so basically, a lot of these questions surround, well, what does the assembly process actually look like? Like, what are people actually doing in order to enact change in the woodland? And so some of the questions have been things like, okay, is the assembly something that is only prompted by the assembly faction, or can it be prompted by other players? Is it something that everybody in the clearing with an assembly participates in, or is it targeted? Many of these sort of deeper questions around when do assemblies happen, who gets to participate, and what exactly that looks like. Because ultimately, I want to ensure that there is an interesting, fairly structured method for player politics that is mediated through card play, that doesn't overly interrupt the natural flow of play. Certainly, earlier versions of this faction ran into a lot of cases where the assemblies were just eating up too much game time, for example. And so it's this tricky balancing act of, you want to make sure that it has an impactful effect, but it doesn't affect the flow of play too much. The other aspects that I'm looking at are, what is the ultimate outcome? So certainly part of the ultimate outcome here is warrior removal. You know, they are trying to cool this war down, and so removing warriors is a very natural thing that could be the outcome. But some of the questions surround, should those warriors be permanently removed from the game? Should they be temporarily removed? Should that removal ignore certain effects that imply the death or injury of those warriors? So lots of sort of nitty gritty questions around like how exactly to represent this. And so as an example of how in the past literal days, I have changed my thinking about this faction, surrounds assembly timing. So I have kind of gone back and forth about, okay, well, when exactly should these assemblies happen? Many of the earlier versions of this faction had assemblies happening just all on the assembly faction's turn. Over time, I have been convinced, and have convinced myself as well, that it's time to experiment with more of an odder timing structure to these assemblies in terms of when it's other factions' turns.
And this is otter as in ODDER, not OTTER, representing the river folk or anything, huh?
Oh no, otter as in the river folk otters. In terms
Okay,
of
okay.
for the river folk, the way that their market works is that they have a start of birdsong window on other
Right.
players' turns where they're interacting with it. And so I'm over the next week or so going to be experimenting more with changing the assembly's timing window so that it's actually on other players' turns. So there are still these questions around like how the assemblies can be structured in a way that provide maximal impact while minimizing flow breaks, and while making sure that the impact is felt but not completely devastating to certain factions. So there are many sort of tight ropes to walk in terms of in terms of how to instrumentalize the basic idea of a faction that is trying to cool down the war through player politics.
And the expansion is going to have some sort of third element. You've been pretty transparent about that up until this point, and with the announcement and the Kickstarter is to come. But that isn't decided yet. Are there kind of hints or ideas or something that, like we can even imagine what that might be or the possibilities could be?
Yeah, absolutely. So, sort of the two primary things that we've been talking about are new maps and a third faction. So those are sort of two of the possibilities here. There is room in terms of the new map space. Um, I've been pretty surprised at the number of people who I've seen talking about the desire for maps that are tunable to player count, and especially tunable toward higher player counts. I really like Root as a 4-player game and as a 3-player game. I personally find that it gets somewhat bogged down when you hit 5, and I never want to play it at 6 personally. But I have heard a lot of desire for a map that's like more suited toward say a five player count that can be tuned to work at 4 players and 3 players. So some kind of map that allows for variable player count construction. Like that is certainly one thing that I am looking at right now in terms of the map space. Um, and then on the faction side, so I do have a third faction that I've been developing that is very strange. Isn't like I will say isn't like any other faction we've ever made, and that's about all I'm comfortable talking about right now, just because we haven't decided whether it's actually going to be a thing. And people are going to have, if we do decide to put it in, people are going to have some probably pretty strong opinions about it. So we'll kind of want to make sure that we're actually going to do it before we go down that route.
Well, if it's not an insect faction, the bug people on BGG are going to flip because since
Uh-huh.
Root came around, every other fan faction feels like it's a bee or an ant or,
Sure.
the grasshoppers or something. People
Right.
are
Right.
clamoring. People have concepts in mind. Um,
Yeah.
so the last thing that I really wanted to ask you about is probably one of the things that you can give the least information on, and that's that right now. Yes, you just had the tentpole release of Arcs, and that's the culmination of a huge amount of work. But when I think about the projects that Leader has announced and are in the midst of working on, that's an Ahoy expansion, an Oath expansion, and now a Root expansion. And as someone who likes to see the new worlds that you create, are there things cooking for standalone game releases that Leader is going to put out either this coming year or sometime in the near future?
Yeah, so we have a lot of new projects and new IPs cooking at the studio. Um, we have not made a decision on which one of those to do yet, but it's pretty clear that like once we have the Oath expansion, the Root expansion in the bag, we'll probably do a totally new IP. There are various options. Uh, we showed some of these off at Gen Con. So Nick, for example, who is the lead developer on Ahoy and designer on all the Ahoy expansion stuff. He's been making a game that's has the code name of Swarm, which is kind of like a bug logistics game. It's got very like, in my opinion, it's very like Sim Ant vibes.
Perfect.
For
That's
yeah,
what we want. That's what us
yeah,
Sim and old Windows 95 and SNES players want.
exactly. So like Nick's working on that. Ted, our operations director, has been working for a long time on a heist game, a sort of like operations level heist game that he's calling Take right now, that involves like trying to be a like an effective heisting organization. So like not just focusing on like a single heist, but actually like can you be? It's like heist tycoon. You know, if we're using video game analogs
Right.
here, it would be like a heist tycoon game. And then Patrick has a bunch of projects in the work, including Opus, which is basically about like it's about like robot sentience largely. It's very weird. It's very cool. So yeah, there are a lot of like things that we're playing with and a lot of things that we're cooking up right now. I also have um, some projects in early concepting that are a little bit too early to talk about just because I've mostly been working on all the root stuff, but I also have some things cooking as well. So yeah, certainly like we have a lot of options, and we are like almost certainly going to do some new thing after we finish up with this stuff. It's just a question of what works for the studio and what makes the most sense.
Well, I think people are going to be excited about it no matter what it's going to be, even if it's Swarm, which doesn't fit into the four-letter scheme. But people
Exactly.
are here for Leader, and I am so glad that I got a chance to talk with you, Josh. For anyone who's listening and or watching this, you can find the Kickstarter for the fourth route expansion on, well, I guess Kickstarter this October. And Josh, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me.
Absolutely. It was a great time.